Good evening. My name is Rika Kadindongo. I'm the Director of the Office of Planning and Community Development. Very excited that you are joining us this evening. You are our first community engagement participants in this next exciting phase of our One Seattle Plan, Comprehensive Plan Update Development. If you are here, that means you already know what I'm about to tell you. We just released our final growth strategy for your review. We also are releasing for the first time the zoning maps for the entire city that describe not only our compliance with the state bill, HB 1110, which transitions us from our current single-family zoning into a new zoning that allows us to have as many as 4 units on a single-family lot, 6 units where close to transit, but then also introduces the new component of our zoning language, if you will, and our tools, which is our neighborhood centers, which acknowledges the existing fabric of the city, but places where we can introduce a higher level of density to make for more walkable communities, to allow you to live in the city without having a car, to walk to a school, walk to a park, walk to a local grocery store, get on a bus or light rail to get into downtown. Very excited for your questions. Part of this session, you'll be learning how you can provide comments to us with this next phase of the plan. And just really appreciative for your involvement in having you here tonight as we kick off this next phase of 2 months of community engagement. With that, I will pass off to my long-range planning manager, Michael Hubner.
Thank you, Rico. So I'm Michael Hubner. I'm here at OPCD as the long-range planning manager. I'm also the project lead for the comprehensive plan update. I'm also joined by Brennan Staley. He is the project lead for our zoning update that accompanies the plan. Brennan and I are going to tag team tonight in presenting information to you and also in answering your questions. But before we start with that, I just wanted to make sure you understood what to expect and what some of the ground rules and logistics were for tonight's session. First, this information session is being recorded and will be shared on our website after the event. We want all of this information and some of our responses to your questions to be available broadly to the public for people that couldn't attend tonight. So I wanted you to be aware of that. Secondly, again, the format will be a relatively brief presentation that Brendan and I will deliver together, and that you will have an opportunity to ask us questions following the presentation, and that we will provide answers in real time. Those questions are posted in writing on using the Q&A button on your window. I think it's in the upper right. You will find that. And even if you're not asking a question, you'll be able to view the questions other people are asking, and you'll have an opportunity to use the thumbs up button to indicate that you like that question and you would like to see us answer it. We will have staff in the background who are moderating the questions that are coming in and providing us those questions that we'll answer in turn. So all of that feedback as we go along will be helpful. There's a chat function in the window as well. The chat is only for messaging our technical staff, the support staff, about technical issues. If you have any problems in participating in this virtual session, please use the chat function. And finally, we're not taking comments during this meeting, so neither the chat function nor the Q&A should be used for delivering comments in response to the proposed zoning changes or the plan itself. Comments can be submitted on our website, zoning.oneseattleplan.com, where you will find several ways that you can deliver comment on maps, in forms online, sending us an email, There are many ways you can provide comment over the next 2 months, but we're not doing that tonight. We're here to provide you with the information so that you can provide informed comments. Next slide, please. So very briefly, I just want to ground this in everybody's shared understanding of what the comprehensive plan itself is. This is a 20-year plan for the growth of the city of Seattle. It expresses a vision for the future as we grow, as we add housing units and people and jobs over time. We expect the city to grow to nearly 1 million people by the mid-2040s, and we're planning for it with this update. The plan guides the coordinated action of many city departments to be ready for that growth, to provide services and infrastructure that we need as we add housing and jobs. And we update this plan once every 10 years. That's under state law, the State Growth Management Act. We're calling this update the One Seattle Plan. The current plan is called Seattle 2035. This is a brand new plan, and it includes at its core a growth strategy, which will be implemented with zoning legislation. We're going to describe both of those things to you tonight in the following slides. Next one, please. So first, just a couple of things to say about why we're doing this. What are the issues and values, and what is at the core of this vision in the growth strategy and in the updated zoning? This is really focused on the city's housing needs and that have been quite challenging in recent years, continue to be so, and we expect the city will add considerable numbers of jobs and people in the coming years where we need to plan for housing in a very comprehensive and groundbreaking way with some of the concepts that we're including in this update in order to address affordability and availability of housing. Some of the values we hope to achieve through providing more housing supply and diversity is to support the economic opportunity and mobility of residents, to address homelessness, to create more inclusive neighborhoods, to reduce regional sprawl and greenhouse gas emissions. The more housing that we can accommodate in Seattle, the less need there is for people to drive long distances to get to their jobs, for example, and to help businesses attract and retain employees. People have to live somewhere if they work in Seattle. Next slide. So here's just a recap of the timeline for the comprehensive plan update. We're now in our 3rd year of the update process. It began in 2022 with public engagement, identifying what we would study as alternatives in an environmental impact statement. We did additional public engagement that informed our development of a draft plan, which was released last spring in March. We had 2 months of public engagement during the spring. I hope that some of you were involved in that public engagement and provided comment. We took in the comments we received from the public, and what you're hearing about tonight, both the mayor's proposed growth strategy and also some of the zoning concepts that we're releasing as a draft, are based on the comment you've given to date, and you now will have 2 months of additional time to provide comment on the new information. Next slide. There's also a timeline for the zoning itself. So as we're working on the plan, we also know that we have to develop a zoning legislation that implements the plan. The plan itself is a concept, is high-level maps, is a policy document. Zoning is the regulations that make the land use concepts actionable through new development. So there are several phases of the zoning that you see represented on this timeline. The first phase includes updating our neighborhood residential zoning to comply with various state laws, most importantly, House Bill 1110, which requires that we allow middle housing up to at least 4 units on all lots across the city, in townhomes, small apartment buildings, fourplexes, triplexes, many different forms of middle housing. The second phase are the changes to our zoning to implement some of the new concepts in our plan itself, the neighborhood centers that Rico mentioned, zoning changes along transit arterials, and also some zoning changes in areas where we are proposing to expand existing urban centers. Next slide, please. So to be clear about what we released last week, we're very excited to make available to the public. First off, the mayor's recommended growth strategy, which is grounded in the comments that we received last spring. That provides context for you to understand the 3 things that have been released for public comment that relate specifically to zoning. One is a summary of the updated neighborhood residential zoning. The second is the draft legislation itself that has all of the detailed rules that would guide development in our neighborhood residential areas. And then the third piece are draft zoning maps for the neighborhood centers, the expansion areas, the transit arterials. We are going to describe all 3 of these pieces of information that have been released to the public and let you know how you can provide comment. Next slide. I'm going to talk about the growth strategy before we get into the details of zoning. I want to update you on the mayor's vision for in the comp plan for a new growth strategy and briefly describe that. At a high level, it's important to understand that the growth strategy is a policy map. It doesn't have a lot of the detail that tells you exactly what's going to change in your neighborhood. That's where the zoning maps come into play, and that's what we're going to direct your attention to with this presentation. But the growth strategy is implemented through the zoning as well as through investments in infrastructure and services to meet our growth needs. And we want you to understand the big picture view, and I'll show that to you in the following slides. So first off, the growth strategy identifies different types of places across the city that have different roles in accommodating growth, either in housing or in jobs. We have regional centers, urban centers, neighborhood centers, an urban neighborhood place type, which is the balance of the city where housing is allowed. We're going to focus primarily on those 4 place types during our presentation tonight, because that's where most of our housing development would occur. But there are also other place types in the growth strategy: our manufacturing industrial centers, other industrial lands in the city, major institutions like the University of Washington, and our parks and open space. We're not going to be talking about those tonight. We really want to focus on housing and the new zoning changes that relate to housing, but do understand there's a broader picture of growth across both housing and jobs and other uses across the city. So I'm going to talk about each of these in turn in the coming slides. So let's talk about the place types. First off, the regional centers. In our previous plan, these have been called urban centers. We have a name change here. So all of our major nodes of development are called centers in the plan. So our regional centers have regional importance. They're the densest neighborhoods in the city with a mix of housing, office, retail, entertainment, access to regional transit like light rail and Sounder commuter rail. And these are designated by the Puget Sound Regional Council because of their regional importance. Places like downtown in the University District, for example. Urban centers, previously referred to as urban villages, are similar places in terms of having a dense mix of housing, jobs, services, and access to transit, but have more of an importance within the city itself. Places like Roosevelt and Columbia City examples. They have a designation at the countywide level as countywide centers, but they're very important to the life of the city as places for shops, goods, services, and housing. The new place type is neighborhood center. These offer a diverse mix of moderate density housing around a commercial core or access to frequent transit. And finally, the urban neighborhood place type, also a new place type, encompasses 2 kinds of development patterns that we will be zoning for in the coming years. One is new neighborhood residential zones that allow that mix of middle housing types with limited commercial activity as well, including corner stores. The other land use pattern within urban neighborhoods is along our transit arterials, where we have frequent bus service, including a diverse mix of low to moderate density housing along those arterials, and in some places commercial activity. Next slide. So here's a map that shows the revised growth strategy, the mayor's proposal for growth strategy to include in the comprehensive plan. This shows 7 regional centers. Those are in the darkest blue on the map, and 25 urban centers, more of a navy blue color as well on the map. Key new components of the growth strategy here are Ballard as a regional center. Formerly, it had been an urban village. A new urban center at the forthcoming light rail station at Northeast 130th Street. That's toward the north end of the map, shown in a blue hatch pattern. And expansions to several of our existing centers, including around new light rail stations in the Squire Park area in central Seattle, and centers that historically have been drawn very small, so making them more of a complete walkable area. The neighborhood centers, which are shown as smaller areas in light blue, there are 30 of them in total, including 29 newly designated neighborhood center areas and 1 existing urban village that has been redesignated as a neighborhood center. And finally, the urban neighborhoods, again, implementing middle housing per HB 1110, and also implementing upzones along our frequent transit arterials. And that's in that cream color throughout much of the city. Next slide, please. For those of you who had participated in the spring, you might be interested to know what's changed since the proposal we had in the spring. Briefly, there are more neighborhood centers to begin with. There are 5 new neighborhood centers at North Magnolia, High Point, Mid Beacon Hill, Upper Fremont, and Hillman City. Another location that had been considered and studied as a neighborhood center was Squire Park in the central area of Seattle. And this area is proposed to be included in an expansion of 2 of our existing centers, the First Hill Capital Regional Center and the 23rd and Union Jackson Urban Center. So it would have many of the characteristics of a neighborhood center, but as part of adjoining centers that are much larger. And finally, South Park is that urban village that has been redesignated as a neighborhood center, again, with some zoning changes to implement that neighborhood center vision. We'll talk about those in the coming slides. Next slide, please. I actually think I'm going to turn it over to Brennan Staley now. He's going to talk about the zoning that implements future land uses in each of these place types.
Thank you, Michael. Yeah, so I'm Brennan Staley. I'm a strategic advisor with the Office of Planning and Community Development. I'm the project lead for the zoning update. So yeah, I'm going to talk about the 2 different, some of the changes that are currently proposing. The first of those changes is the proposal to update our neighborhood residential zones. Today, neighborhood residential zones represent more than 2/3 of the city. And within these zones, you're allowed to have 1 home per lot, plus up to 2 accessory dwelling units. And these areas play a really important role in the city by providing opportunities for households to own homes with multiple bedrooms and direct access to outdoor open space. However, these neighborhoods also are increasingly out of reach for most households. The minimum sales price of a detached home now exceeds over $1 million. And so that means a large portion of Seattle is inaccessible to low and moderate income housing. Additionally, the Washington State Legislature adopted a new bill, House Bill 1110, in 2023. This bill requires cities across Washington State to allow a wider variety of housing types, including duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, and apartments throughout residential zones. In Seattle, it specifically requires that that every lot be allowed to have at least 4 units. And 6 units if they're within a quarter mile of major transit stops, such as light rail or bus rapid transit, or on lots in which at least 2 of the units are affordable. So in order to comply with state law and also meet our city's goals, we're proposing to change many of the development standards that apply to neighborhood residential zones. This table shows the proposed updated development standards that would apply to new development in neighborhood residential zones. Where these standards have changed based on public feedback, we've highlighted that in bold and italics. So the number of units that's allowed on a lot is regulated through a maximum density. And you can see our proposal here is to allow 1 unit per 1,250 square feet of lot area, except that consistent with state law, at least 4 units would be allowed on all lots, regardless of lot size, and 6 would be allowed within a quarter mile of major transit, or if 2 is affordable. One important note is that lot size, for the purposes of calculating the number of units allowed, does not include environmentally critical areas like creeks or steep slopes, and that means that would help prevent development in those areas while still allowing development outside of them. The size of buildings that's allowed on a property is regulated through a floor area ratio, or FAR. The FAR, you can calculate the total amount of floor area that is allowed on a lot by calculating the floor area ratio by the size of the lot. So for example, on a 5,000 square foot lot, an FAR 1 would mean that the buildings could have a total of 5,000 square feet of floor area. So similar to the existing rules and also the proposal that was released in March, the amount of floor area that would be allowed would vary based on the number of units that are proposed on the site. So sites with more units would be allowed to have slightly more total floor area. So while the floor area ratio proposal that was released in March had a maximum FAR of 0.9, under the proposed changes, that would be increased to 1.2. The reason for that change is we heard lots of feedback that there's an interest in really prioritizing family size units, especially 3-bedroom homes in neighborhood residential zones. And so that additional FAR would ensure that even if you build the maximum density, they are still getting 3-bedroom homes. The lot coverage that we're proposing is the same as what came out in March, and that's 50%. That's the percentage of the lot that can be covered by buildings and garages. The height limit would be increased from 30 feet to 32 feet. And that really is just to allow for more livable space in the buildings, and especially for stacked flats to allow more insulation between floors to help make them more quiet and livable. We also are proposing to implement a new minimum open space requirement, that also known as an amenity area requirement, and that would be same as in the March proposal, 20% of the lot. The minimum setbacks that would be required, the distance between buildings and lot lines, would be 10 feet in the front. For rear, it would be 10 feet if there's no alley, or 0 feet if there's an alley. One change compared to our proposal in March is that it would only be 5 feet for accessory dwelling units. That is the current standard for accessory dwelling units today, and so we're proposing to retain that. And then the side setback would continue to be 5 feet. Additionally, something new that we're proposing now is that there would be a bonus for stacked flats. So stacked flats are buildings like apartments or condos where people tend to live on one floor, above and below other units. Stacked flats that are located within a quarter mile of frequent transit and are on lots that are 6,000 square feet or greater would have an FAR of 1.2 instead of 1.4 instead of 1.2. And a maximum density limit of 1 unit per 650 square feet. So that would allow a 6-unit building on a 6,000 square foot lot, which would generally be 3 units per floor. The reason we added this is that we heard a lot of public comments during engagement that there's a lot of interest in encouraging this building form, since it allows people to live on one floor, and that can be really great, especially for people who need accessible units or units where they think they can age in place. 2 other provisions. One, we are also providing a bonus for affordable housing units. So buildings where at least half the units are affordable, that means both they're rent and income restricted. So they're reserved for people who need those units, and those people wouldn't pay more than 30% of their income on those units. Buildings that meet that requirement would be allowed to have a maximum height of 4 stories, a maximum lot coverage of 60%, a higher density of 1 unit per 4,000 square feet, and an additional floor area ratio, or additional floor area with a total floor area ratio of 1.8. Given the high level of affordability that's required, this bonus would predominantly be used by nonprofit developers that are receiving public subsidy. Similar to the proposal in March, we'll continue to have a proposal that would allow small-scale commercial uses, such as restaurants or retail stores, on any corner lot in neighborhood residential zones and multifamily zones, provided those businesses meet certain standards such as maximum size, hours of operation, standards on nose and odor, and also on the location screening of solid waste and other outdoor activities. This is something that was in the March proposal that we're proposing to continue. Due to the high cost of construction, it's unlikely that property owners would be using this to develop new buildings expressly for corner stores, although that is allowed. However, this change might allow property owners to use existing buildings, possibly with additions or modifications to accommodate these businesses. To help people understand the potential impacts of these changes, the City commissioned Makers Architecture to develop visualizations of housing that might be developed under these standards. These are 3 examples of what might happen in these zones. Obviously, overall, these standards are likely to result primarily in 3-story, 3-bedroom ownership units. However, near frequent transit, it's possible we might also see things like the smaller units in condominium buildings, as is shown in that 9-unit prototype on the right, where people are using that stacked flat bonus. So a complete set of visualizations, including these and other ones, is contained in our Updating Seattle's Neighborhood Residential Zones document, which is available on our website. The city is also proposing to update our off-street parking requirements. Today, we already have no parking requirement in existing centers, so urban centers, urban villages, where that are near frequent transit. You can see those areas in dark blue on the map. Consistent with the state law, we are required to also remove parking requirements within a half mile of light rail and bus rapid transit stops. You can see those in the purple. Outside of those areas, though, we are proposing to change our parking requirements. Currently, they are generally 1 space is required for each principal unit. We are changing that so 1 space would be allowed for every 2 principal units, and that would allow more flexibility, especially for properties that have steep slopes, unusual lot configurations, and also for stacked flats, where providing underground or structured parking can be prohibitively expensive. Accessory dwelling units would continue to be exempt from parking requirements, as is the requirement today. So the city has also released draft zoning maps for public review. So zoning regulates the type and size of buildings that are allowed on a lot. Every property in Seattle is designated as being in a specific zone, and that indicates the specific regulations that apply to that lot. So as part of implementing the One Seattle plan, we're proposing to change the zoning on many properties, which will affect what property owners are allowed to build. Because the city doesn't acquire property for public-private construction, any new construction on rezone lots would happen gradually when a property owner decides to redevelop or when a property is sold and purchased by a developer. The draft zoning maps, which are available on our website, show proposed zoning changes in 3 types of areas. First, in new neighborhood residential centers, neighborhood centers, in the expansion areas of existing regional and urban centers, and along frequent transit routes. You can see 3 examples of what you might see on that map. The online maps allow you to kind of scroll around and look at different areas throughout the city, and they show the boundaries of the proposed boundaries for centers, as well as the existing and proposed zoning. So as you can see on that map, you'll find there are blue lines that show the proposed boundaries of designated centers, and dashed blue lines that show the boundaries where existing centers are proposed to be expanded. You can also kind of get a sense of the proposal just by the colors. Gray lots show areas where no change to zoning is proposed. Yellow lots yellow shows lots that would remain in the neighborhood residential zone, which would be updated. Brown shows lots that are proposed to be changed to a new zone, which would be a multifamily zone. Orange lots show places that would be changed to a new zone, that would be a neighborhood commercial zone. And there are also some existing centers that are shown in blue, which indicate that no rezones are proposed today, but could be considered as part of phase 3. Sorry. So as you zoom out in on the maps, you'll show that they also have labels that show what zones currently apply and which are proposed to apply in the future. If you click on those, it'll bring up very specific information about each of those, including what the development standards would be in that area generally, and pictures of recent development in that zone. So obviously our website provides a lot more detail on that, so you can really get a lot more information there. The zoning changes in neighborhood centers are intended really to allow a wider variety of housing options, particularly apartments and condos around an existing commercial district or frequent transit. And so the proposed zoning in that areas is mostly 4 to 6 stories with higher zoning in the center. There are 9 existing centers which are proposed to be expanded in areas that you have new light rail, or areas that have much smaller than other centers, and in the Square Park neighborhood. Because regional and urban centers are much larger than neighborhood centers, they are obviously both bigger in geography, but they also contain a wider range of housing, including heights from 3 to 8 stories. The changes on frequent transit routes are confined to properties that are directly abutting those frequent transit routes or immediately next to them. And zoning in there is generally limited to 5 stories. So again, I encourage you to go onto our website, zoning.oneseattleplan.com, where you can find those interactive maps. There's also an opportunity there to provide location-specific comments by using the commenting tool. So the city is looking for feedback both on the proposal to update neighborhood residential zones and the draft zoning maps through December 20th of this year. So you can find the project documents themselves, the commenting tools, and the interactive zoning maps on the website. In addition, we're going to be engaging the public through a series of events. We're going to have 7 in-person open house sessions. Obviously, we're having 2 online info sessions, including the one today and another after the in-person sessions. We're also having office hours where people can come in with questions and talk to directly to city planners. Very briefly, I do want to mention phase 3. It's recently announced that we are going to be looking to consider additional zoning changes in existing regional urban centers as part of a later phase 3 of this zoning update. Regional and urban centers represent areas with the densest mix of housing, jobs, shops, services, and access to transit. The maps on the right show the location of existing regional centers and the new one in Ballard in dark blue, as well, and then on the location of existing urban centers, the new one proposed at 130th in lighter blue. So scoping for this work is planned to begin in fall of 2025, and it will be coordinated with ongoing sub-area planning for regional centers that's happening, as well as stationary planning along the Sound Transit 3 route from West Seattle to Ballard. So we're not looking for feedback on phase 3 at this time, but there will be significant public engagement as part of that process when it begins in 2025 and runs through 2026. So we're now going to transition to the question and answer portion of this session. After the Q&A, you can find more resources and the ability to comment on our website. If you have additional questions that come up, you can obviously go to one of our office hours, but you can also email them to oneseattleplan.zoning@seattle.gov. And obviously we'll bring this up again as a reminders, but now I'm going to turn it over to Sefriana and Aja on our communications team, and they're going to queue up questions. And again, remember, you can always post questions at any time using the Q&A feature, which can be assessed through the button at the top of your team's application. Thank you.
Brennan, you're on mute.
Yeah, thank you. So we are going to, I'm actually going to go read some of the questions and hand them out to people. So, and again, remember, if you can always give a thumbs up if you're, I think, especially interested in some of these questions. I'd encourage people to, add more as you want to. So the first question we have here is, how was the existing density for designated residential centers considered when deciding to introduce 4 to 5 story structures in neighborhoods that already have street parking challenges and offer greenway for walking and biking. Michael, do you want to take that about how we came up with the basic concepts for the centers?
Sure. And I assume that I'm going to assume that this question is referring to the neighborhood centers, which is the new type of center. First of all, and I think we touched on this a couple of points in the presentation itself, the concept for the neighborhood centers is built around an existing center, if you will, a center of activity generally. We find those in many parts of neighborhoods across Seattle, largely centered around an important transit access point, a bus rapid transit station, and also existing neighborhood business nodes containing uses like grocery stores and pharmacies and post office, other public services. So first off, the neighborhood centers themselves are identified based on these locations that have those attributes. In many of them already had some zoning for essentially apartment or multifamily housing, but often very limited along the arterials or near the center of those places. And the concept here is to provide new opportunities for more housing and more diverse housing within a 3 to 4 minute walk around those central places within neighborhoods. So extending out 1, 2, in some cases 3 blocks, depending on how long the blocks are, a fairly small area within the neighborhoods for additional types and diversity of housing. Most of those areas are currently zoned for neighborhood residential. So what you will see in the proposed zoning maps are new zones proposed for those several block areas around the existing commercial and bus and transit nodes, going above and beyond neighborhood residential. Primarily, you're going to find low-rise zoning, which would allow 4 or 5 stories, where current neighborhood residential will be capped at 3 stories. So a little more height, the ability to provide additional housing units in small to mid-size apartment configurations and townhomes and other types of housing in the neighborhood center. And this is a vision that's stated in the comprehensive plan itself, 4 or 5 stories along the arterials, maybe up to 6 stories. That's what you see reflected in the zoning maps. Each one of those neighborhood centers has a different zoning map because they are all different. And in preparing these draft maps, we looked at the factors that were in play in different areas, the parcels, development sites, critical areas, access to transit, and you will see different zoning proposed in different areas, but generally in that 4 to 5 and in some places 6 stories.
Great. The second question, which I'll take myself, why upzone extremely close to the noisy arterial that frequent transit runs along instead of zoning in a larger area around each individual stop? The former option forces renters to live directly on the most dangerous roads in the city. So one, I think there's a comment there. I appreciate that. So obviously there's 2 different kinds of changes we're proposing. One obviously is changes in neighborhood centers and in expansion areas. Those obviously are primarily putting housing off of arterial streets in kind of the areas, near business districts and transit, but not right on them. The change obviously on frequent transit streets, though, would primarily put new zoning on those streets, which do tend to be louder. And I think the reason for the existing proposal is that, a balance, obviously, transit, those people closest to transit are on those louder streets, often a lot of the shops and services on those streets as well. So there's kind of a balance there of, trying to get people closer to those things, but obviously there's also a trade-off there of those streets are louder, et cetera.
But Brennan, I think it's also the case that our neighborhood centers that I was just describing are also along some of these very same transit routes and do provide a lot of new opportunity for housing, both on the frequent transit arterials and in a 1, 2, or in some cases 3 blocks distance from the arterials themselves. So we are providing that in this neighborhood center concept, and less so along the frequent transit routes between them.
Great. Here's another one for you, Michael. When will Seattle decide on zoning change needed in reference to areas near Link Light Rail, especially 130th and 145th?
Yeah, so the as we emphasized in the presentation, there's a in the mayor's proposed growth strategy, there is a new urban center at the 130th light rail station. At 145th, there's a bus rapid transit station along 145th Street. That is proposed as a neighborhood center. Those two are within the general station area. The light rail station at often is referred to at 145th. It's actually in Shoreline at 148th Street. So it's not within the city of Seattle. There isn't a proposal directly around that station. That's the city of Shoreline is taking the lead on that. The zoning changes around both the 130th light rail station and the 145th BRT station are part of the map set that was released for public comment last week, and the legislation will be transmitted to the council for consideration in early 2025 by May at the latest.
Great. The next question here is, what criteria was used to pick the location of neighborhood centers? That is what they're called. So there were 3 major criteria that we used. One is, places that already had access to shops and services, places that had access to transit, and basically we wanted to be able to have more people who are living in housing to be able to walk to those amenities, both because it's easier to do without a car, but also because it is makes for a very vibrant neighborhood. We also looked at geographic spread after kind of considering where are those where are the transit, the shops and service, where are these nodes that would be great places to build more housing. We also looked if there are areas of the city that didn't have any, that were kind of major gaps. And so we also looked to have a wider geographic spread so that, basically every neighborhood, every area of the city had a wider variety of housing types so that people kind of stay in those neighborhoods as their needs changed over time. Obviously, we put forward then those those draft ones forward in March. We heard a lot of public feedback, and so they were updated really based on what we heard from the public. So those 5 new centers were in Squire Park were things that we heard, specifically from from the public as places that would be good to allow more housing. Great. So the next one here are as many single family lots are 7,200 square feet. Are these lots restricted to 4 units or 6 if 2 are affordable? So our proposal is obviously there's kind of we're complying with state law, so there's a baseline that they're all allowed to have at least 4 or 6 if they're affordable. But we also have the specific proposal is a density of 1 unit per 1,250 square feet. So that means as lots become larger, they're allowed to have proportionally more units. And I'm always worried about doing math on the fly, but that on a 7,200 square foot lot, that would mean you'd be allowed to have 5 units, or 6 if they're affordable, or if it's near major transit. And so that would keep scaling. So if you have a 10,000 square foot lot, you could have 8 units. You have 20,000 square foot lot, you could have 16. Okay, there's another one here, and I was stalling on this one because I wasn't sure exactly if I got the locations, but the question is, there is an expansion of zoning and housing density along 5th Avenue and Pinehurst. Why wasn't Roosevelt also included? Can you share some of the health impact data used to make this decision, especially with the risk of housing density within 1,000 square feet of the freeway? Expanding zoning in Roosevelt would reduce this risk. So I apologize if I get the meaning of some of this. So for us, Roosevelt, if you're talking about the area around the Roosevelt Light Rail Station, that is an area that is already in an urban village, what would be called an urban center as part of this proposal. So that is an area that we upzoned in the past as part of implementing mandatory housing affordability, and that is something that would be considered as part of phase 3. So it's not proposed at this time, but rather as part of that phase 3, which will have a lot of engagement on in the future. I don't know if this actually was about Roosevelt Ave, which I believe goes close
Brendan,
by.
if I could interject, I suspect the question is asking about Roosevelt Avenue and not Roosevelt as the center. We could have this wrong. I will say this, I'll happy to contribute to this answer. One thing I'll point out as we start working our way through questions, we understand that a lot of people will have very geographically detailed questions that they'll want to ask. We'll do our best to answer those on the fly this evening. If to the extent we don't provide satisfying answers, or we're really, we don't have all of the detailed maps right in front of us at our fingertips, I would invite you to attend one of our staff virtual open houses office hours, where we can open up a map, look at it together in a shared screen online, really get at some of the geographically specific questions you may have. We also would have an easier time doing that in some of the in-person info sessions. So just wanted to say that as a general comment. But with regard to this question, I think what's going on around in North Seattle around 5th versus Roosevelt is the location of the frequent transit routes. That there are parts of Roosevelt that are not served by the frequent transit routes, and also the location of the light rail station, specifically if we're talking about the new urban center in Northeast 130th, which is on both the east and west of 5th, and where that light rail station will be located along I-5. So we took into account a variety of locational characteristics, including transit and existing business districts, and I suspect that the part of Roosevelt that you're interested in didn't have any of those characteristics that would have yielded a proposal for an upzone.
Yeah, and maybe a little more specifically, as we looked at zoning in these areas, obviously we considered a lot of specific elements, including where was the transit, where are the shops and services, as well as other local site conditions. In the Pinehurst Holler Lake proposed center around 130th, the goal was really to provide the densest housing in the shortest distance walk to that light rail station, and then it gets, as you get a little farther, it gradually goes down, although there's also substantial density along some of those existing business districts as well. So I think that the reason why is so close to the light rail station, Roosevelt Way does have proposed heights as high as 85 feet, which gradually goes down as it heads south. Those are more in the scale of 4 and 5 stories. And Roosevelt Way today already has a lot of existing apartment buildings that are developed to 4-story zoning. And so maybe that's why some of those are things that are considered in that specific zoning proposal. Next question here is, are there height limits on the dwelling units envisioned by HB 1110? Yeah, so first, so HB 1110, it basically kind of sets a minimum of what we're required to allow, and that means primarily in the change that we're envisioning in our neighborhood residential zones. So we're proposing a height limit of 32 feet in neighborhood residential zones. That's an increase from the 30 feet that already exists today. Plus, you can have a pitched roof of up to 5 feet on top of that. That 35 feet is really pretty consistent with a 3-story house, and with the idea being that but a slightly more height so that you can have a little better floor to ceiling spaces.
Brendan, I think you meant 32 feet. Just
32
feet.
It's, I apologize.
Yeah, that's okay. 32 foot height. Is there also, if I may, I'm going to channel the questioner a little bit here. Does the 5 foot to accommodate additional 5 feet to accommodate pitched roof also apply on top of the 32 feet?
That's right. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So in total, the very top of the pitched roof could be 37 feet.
But the top of the upper floor would be up to 32 feet, essentially. Yeah.
That's right.
Okay.
And just briefly, again, that the reason for that height is, often people like to have the first floor a little bit elevated off the ground. And then when you have it 4 feet off the ground, if you have a 30-foot height limit, that results in pretty small, low, awkward feeling ceilings. So that's the reason for the small change. Michael, a question for you. What is the new growth capacity under these proposed zoning changes?
Yeah, great question. And that's something that we really want to emphasize, the importance and value of the mayor's proposed growth strategy. Now that we do have a zoning proposal to analyze, we have we have estimated that the capacity is for about 330,000 new units overall. That is roughly doubling of the existing capacity for new housing. That is at about 165 new units. That's under existing zoning. So the changes would then add approximately an additional 165 units of potential new homes to be added over the next 20 years. We think this puts us in a really good position to address some of the really most challenging aspects of our housing crisis, which is providing enough market potential that home builders can find sites to build on and meet the needs that are driven by the kinds of rapid job growth, for example, that we've seen in recent years and that may continue to occur at times in the future, and also provide a more affordable and ample and varied housing choices in more neighborhoods.
The next question is, if the areas inside urban centers are going to be rezoned in 2026, why update the zoning now? Your draft map shows proposed rezones inside the urban villages to LR1 across the street of LR2 and LR3 new areas. For example, in the lots that are currently zoned RSL in West Seattle Junction. Yeah, so there is one, there are two exceptions to the rule of changes in urban centers. One, there are a lot of areas in urban centers that are zoned residential small lot today. This is a type of neighborhood residential zone. As part of this update that we're doing, they you don't generally comply with HB 1110, so we have to update those. And our proposal is to get rid of RSL as a unique zone, instead move towards other zones. And so basically the choice was either to revert them to neighborhood residential zones or to change them to low-rise 1. And given the purpose of, since we had to do something, given the purpose of urban centers, we thought that low-rise 1 would be a more appropriate zone within those. And so that is a change that we are proposing to make today, since the RSL zone is going away. The other change is that in some areas, such as Admiral Junction, where there are some small changes on the very edges of centers where that are proposed to be expanded, just to make a more consistent zoning between that goes, transitions from the core, downward toward the edge. So those are the only really two examples of where we are doing some changes today.
And to be clear, in response to this question as well, and I'm going to summarize here, the RSL change, the change away from RSL was really done because we have to, and low-rise 1 is really the best choice of change in the short term for what is currently RSL. And RSL, residential small lot, is entirely within existing centers, so it really had to be in those locations. And secondly, with regard to really any of the zoning changes that you see within the boundaries of existing centers on the proposal released last week, in phase 3, where zoning changes generally in the boundaries of existing centers citywide will be considered, there may be additional changes above and beyond what you see on the map on those locations. So a place that's going from RSL to LR1 may go taller as part of phase 3, but that's not a change that we're proposing at this time. Great.
The next question is, what is the definition of frequent transit. And so frequent transit is a definition we actually already have within the city. It's currently used to determine where parking requirements are, where we have parking requirements in some areas. But it includes areas that generally have a service of about 15 minutes on average during weekdays and 30 minutes on average during parts of the weekend. And there is a kind of more detailed one that we're happy to give you if you want to reach out by email. The next one here is for you, Michael. What is the status of the anti-displacement framework for the comprehensive plan, and does it go farther than existing city law?
So we are working on anti-displacement strategies as part of this update. We understand that a lot of people are interested in and concerned about the potential impacts of the housing crisis on people's ability to afford a home in the city. And many people are being forced to leave either because they can't afford the rent, or their property taxes have gone up, or building has been, something they lived in is proposed to be redeveloped. Something that we've tracked for many years, and understand that that is an issue. One of the most important things that we feel that we're doing, and this relates to what we're talking about tonight on anti-displacement, is provide ample housing that the city needs to be as affordable and have as many housing choices for people who want to remain in the city, to remain in their neighborhoods as possible. So I want to emphasize that point right up front, is that the growth strategy is an anti-displacement strategy in of itself. But with regard to the broader spectrum of strategies and tools we have to combat displacement, what we're going to be doing for with the release of the final plan in December is release I'll call it an anti-displacement strategy that is predicated on the rich toolbox that we have right now for providing assistance to communities, to homeowners, to small businesses and others who are at risk of displacement, and also a richer set of data and ability to monitor where displacement risk is most prevalent, most acute, so that we can focus those efforts to be most effective in reaching the people that most need the help to be able to stay in the city. So stay tuned on that. We don't have a newly released document at this time, but that's something that will accompany the release of the final plan in December.
Great. The next question is about phase 2 legislation. So the timeline that we showed earlier shows that phase 1 legislation was what's published in October. That's correct. We published that phase 1 legislation that includes the changes in neighborhood residential, as well as some other changes that are necessary to comply with various state laws, including changes in low-rise and mid-rise zones. But the question here is, so is a phase 2 legislation draft still forthcoming? And that would help clarify some of the zoning specs for new urban centers, especially for things that are already on the map, such as LR3, LR1, LR2. So yes, so a full draft text of the phase 2 legislation is proposed to be released in early November. That would include some changes to standards for low-rise 3, as well as the standards for the new mid-rise zone. I will say, at a high level that, the LR3 that we're showing on the map is a 5-story zone that is consistent generally with the standards that exist today for LR3 in urban centers and villages. We're proposing a new mid-rise zone, which would be a 6-story zone. Currently, we do not have a residential 6-story zone. That's what we're calling MR1. Which again would be a height of 6 stories. And then MR2 is referencing the existing mid-rise that we have today, which has a height of 80 feet and is generally a 7 or 8-story building. But yeah, so we anticipate that legislation will come out in early November, and we will email the people who are on the listserv at that time to let them know that it's available.
And Brandon, I want to be a little bit careful in terms of setting expectations here. It might be more like mid-November, excuse me. So we haven't set an exact release date yet, but it's something we're working to get out into the public as soon as we can.
Great. So there's a follow-up question on the frequent transit. Can you explain what is considered rapid or frequent transit? Looking at one of the up zone spurs, the current bus route is infrequent every 30-minute with only one route. Is the city expanding bus routes with such upzoned areas? So again, yeah, so the current definition of frequent transit, again, is that 15 minutes during the kind of core parts of the weekday and then 30 minutes on parts of the weekend. There isn't a specific proposal to change bus routes as part of this rezoning effort, but obviously, the location of housing is one of the key aspects that Metro considers as they consider their routes. And so over time, as housing production comes into these areas, that could lead to more transit in those areas.
Well, and Brandon, if I could add to that, we've also worked closely with SDOT, Department of Transportation here at the city, who recently completed a Seattle transportation plan. The growth strategy map that we shared with you tonight is something we have, the SDOT has had access to it and has been working with, and it's something that they incorporated into their planning for desired transit improvements, which of course would be implemented by a provider like Metro. That's one part of the answer as well. So we are trying to identify any gaps in our transit service or other transportation infrastructure to serve the areas that we are proposing to focus growth in the plan and with the new zoning. But the other thing is, I'm not sure if maybe I misheard the question. It may be that the questioner was suggesting that they're looking at an area that they have information that suggests may not meet the criteria for frequent transit. That would be a great question to bring to one of our staff office hour times. We'd be happy to get that feedback and look into that kind of thing. We are interested. The public has knowledge too, and knows their neighborhoods and knows that there are factors or issues that we need to be considering in finalizing the zoning maps. And please bring that to our attention maybe in a different forum, send us something in writing, or reach out to us.
Great. When reading the zoning ordinance draft one, I noticed there are circumstances where low-rise 3 has a lower FAR than neighborhood residential. 1.3 in low-rise 3 without an MHA suffix and outside of urban centers village versus 1.4 for neighborhood residential. Is this choice intentional? And if so, what is the intention behind this choice? So there are some areas that do not have a mandatory housing affordability suffix that have lower FAR. That is basically limited pretty much exclusively to historic districts where there was interest in kind of retaining a lower height limit. That is really a very, very small exception to things. But that was purposeful. When those zoning, the MHA was implemented, there was a purposeful effort, to not implement it in certain areas where we didn't want to have also that increase in development capacity. So the next question, this is for Michael. Shouldn't this be a King County plan instead of a Seattle plan?
Let me see how I can answer that. Well, first of all, under state law, each local jurisdiction creates its own comprehensive plan. So local jurisdictions include cities and counties. King County does have a comprehensive plan. The King County comprehensive plan is also going through a major update at the same time that we're doing ours. The King County comprehensive plan covers two things. One is for land that is outside of cities, the unincorporated area. Their plan does many of the same things that our plan does. They have a future land use map or a growth strategy. They do zoning. They plan in a very detailed way for the services and investments that are needed in the unincorporated area. The King County plan does include very high-level policies about the county as a whole. Those roughly correspond with what are called countywide planning policies, which are adopted jointly by the county and the cities in the county, including Seattle. And when we do our comprehensive plan, we are consistent with those countywide planning policies, but they are very high level. So for example, they set things like growth targets for different cities, or have very higher level language than what will be in our comprehensive plan about the kinds of things we should talk about in our comprehensive plan, so that we're consistent with all the other cities in the county. So they're two very different documents, and for the city, for this kind of thing, for zoning, for local land use decisions, is very much the city government that is a more appropriate place for us to be doing this, and it's what happens under state law.
So the next question says, in Upper Queen Anne, some lots near the Main Anne are proposed to be rezoned to MR1, which stands for mid-rise 1. What does mid-rise zoning enable in terms of building height and FAR, and how is it different than the proposed neighborhood commercial 75-foot zoning along the main avenue? So great question. And first, just as an aside, when people look at the zoning maps, if you click on sites, it will come up with a high-level description, which basically kind of includes the types of housing that's allowed, the zoning heights for each zone, as well as some pictures. But mid-rise is specifically a zone that's focused on residential development, and mid-rise 1 is a 6-story zone, so it's a type of zone that could result in apartments or condos that are 6-story. Mid-rise zoning is it has setbacks on all sides, so 5 foot on the well, they vary, but generally about 5 feet on the sides and more in the front and rear. So you have kind of separation for each building around the lots. And it also has limits on FAR, et cetera. We're gonna have some of those details that are coming out, as we said, in November. But it does vary pretty specific from a neighborhood commercial zone. Neighborhood commercial zones are zones that do not have setbacks. So they're actually designed to create a kind of continuous storefront. So properties can come right to the lot line, both to the side lot line, so they touch the buildings next to us, and out to the sidewalk, so that people are walking from the sidewalk right into buildings and shops and services. Neighborhood commercial zones also tend to have, commercial uses on the first floor, and then residential or commercial uses on upper floors. So that's the major difference. Again, is that that neighborhood commercial is meant to have that kind of continuous storefront, and so have both different uses, but they also tend to be larger buildings for the same lot size. We're getting through most of them here, but so I'm going to just take a second and make sure I'm not missing some. Okay, here's another one. How is affordable housing defined? So affordable housing under all these programs has to be rent restricted or sales price restricted, and that means that the rents or sales price have to be set so that a household that is living in them that meets the criteria for. Sorry, maybe I should start. But each one is based on a affordability level that is expressed as a percentage of the area median income. So for rental, that is 60% of area median income, and for ownership, that is 80% of area median income. So each of those buildings has to be rent and income or price restricted, such that a person of that meeting that AMI threshold that's in that building would not have to pay more than 30% of their income to the price of housing. It also has to be restricted to people making that income. So a rental building that is affordable would have to be restricted so that it could only be rented to people who make 60% of area median income. There are also standards in the city that the units have to be of a consistent size and character, such that if you have a mix of bedroom sizes, that the affordable units have to meet a similar mix of bedroom sizes, etc. They also can't have separate entrances, so they really are integrated into that building. Okay, I was always confused about accessory dwelling units and the number of units on a lot, as it would seem like one could build 4 units on a lot and each one could allow 2 accessory dwelling units. So there's 2 bills that were passed over the last 2 years that regulate how cities, the number of units that are allowed on lot and the number of ADUs. And so again, HB 1110 says that you do have to have at least 4 units on each lot. And there's a separate piece of legislation that said for most lots, you have to allow 2 ADUs. However, there's also language there that says how those interact. And so specifically, that means that the accessory dwelling units that are allowed can count towards the number of units required under HB 1110. So what that means for a 5,000 square foot lot is that under state law, we have to allow you to build 4 units on that 5,000 square foot lot. You could decide to build 4 principal units, and they could be, sold separately, could be subdivided. You could also take that lot and subdivide it into 4 lots and then build 1 principal structure on each of those lots. You could also choose for that 5,000 square foot lot to build 2 principal units and 2 accessory units. So you can kind of get to that 4 units through a wide variety of things. However, if you can't build 4 principal units and then also build 4 accessory dwelling units, if you subdivide so that has those 4 units, each of those units can have only 1 principal dwelling unit. They can't have accessory dwelling units. So essentially, you can't double count in that sense. That 4 units is inclusive of accessory dwelling units and principal dwelling units. The next question is,
Brandon, I'm so no, these are, and I'm gonna direct this at our participants here too, which is, I want to acknowledge, and I know that people come to a session like this with a lot of different degrees of familiarity with land use and with zoning. This is really complicated stuff, and I appreciate your interest and whatever entry point you're coming at this from, being here and being part of the community conversation around this and asking the questions. So this is one of those complicated points as well. So is the bottom line here, I want to make sure that people have the right takeaway, that on that 5,000 square foot lot, we would allow 4 units regardless of what the configuration is, whether you're calling it, whether it's principal, it's 4 units. It can just happen in multiple different ways.
That's right. And even if you subdivide it into multiple lots, you can still only get those 4 units.
You can't game the system. There is no loophole there. It's the 4 units. Okay, very good.
Great. Will the MHA pay/performance system continue? If so, will the system be similar to that in place today? So mandatory MHA stands for mandatory housing affordability, and these are requirements that we place on certain development. Basically, anytime we provide a substantial increase in zoning capacity, that MHA is applied. So in all the zoning that we're talking about where things are being rezoned to a new zone, such as neighborhood residential going to low-rise 1 or low-rise 1 going to low-rise 3, that MHA would be required on those lots. And as those rezones are higher, for bigger rezones, we actually will require more and higher MHA requirements through our suffix program. So for example, if you already has you have a low-rise 1 zone that's already has an M suffix and it goes to low-rise 2 or 3, it actually would have an M suffix, which means that it has to meet a higher mandatory housing affordability requirement. We are not, however, proposing to require a mandatory housing affordability on existing neighborhood residential zones. Those do not have MHA today. So in terms of the proposal, that's how it would be implemented. We are not proposing this time to make any changes to the payment and performance requirements. So you, again, through mandatory housing affordability, you either have to set aside a portion of the units on your lot as affordable, or you have to pay into a fund, which we use then to work with nonprofits to build that in mixed projects. So we're not proposing this time to change any of the basic payment and performance requirements of the systems, the payment amounts, the percentage amounts, the timing of the payments, none of those are proposed to change as part of this update. However, I will point out that when MHA was put in place, the idea was that after 5 years, we would conduct kind of a more thorough review of the program, and that is something that we're hoping to do over the next couple of years. So there may be opportunities as part of that kind of separate work to revisit how is MHA working and what might we change. Another one. For the setback requirement of 10 feet, is that 10 feet from the curb or 10 feet from the sidewalk? It's actually neither of those things. It is 10 feet from the property line. So it's the place where your property starts. It has to be set back 10 feet from that. Sidewalks are very often placed up right against the property line. So in many cases, that is 10 feet from the sidewalk, but in some cases, it's even more. And obviously the curb tends to be another 10 or so feet from the edge of the property line. So from the curb, it tends to be more like 20 feet. But again, the width of the location of the curb varies a lot in different parts of the city. How was the existing, oh, sorry, I think this is one we already did. I already did that one. So I am looking through here and I think that we have answered all the questions that were put forward. Oh no, here's one. To provide housing for seniors and disabled persons, elevators are needed. Will new 4 to 6 story buildings be required to have elevators? So this is a slightly complicated question. It's an aspect of the building code. At a high level, elevators are required for buildings around either that 5th. Usually around that 4th or 5th story. So 6-story buildings are all required to have elevators. Smaller buildings, it varies a little bit. When elevators are included, even voluntarily or required, then you are required to set aside a portion of your units as being accessible. Obviously, one of the ideas of the stacked flats is that it would create more units that people can build on one floor. And so when obviously even in those buildings, the first floor tend to be accessible in smaller units and actually are required to be accessible in larger units. So it is a little bit complicated, but generally if they're stacked flats, you'll get at least some accessible units on the ground floor, and certainly for buildings that are 6 stories or more, and then in the middle it can be a little bit complicated depending on the specifics. Another question here: why is the LR3 height shown as 55 feet, even though it is outside the urban village boundary? I believe that LR3 actually, so today that LR3 has a height limit of 50 feet if they're inside of centers, and 40 feet if they are outside of centers. As part of the proposal that we're putting forward, we want LR3 to be kind of consistent height across inside and outside of centers, and so we're putting it forward as a 5-story zone, which generally means more like 50 feet. The specifics of that, again, are going to be part of this phase 2 legislation, which we hope to release in early November. Next question. You said that the lack of parking requirements is consistent with state law. Does this mean is exactly the same as what is required by state law? If Seattle's proposal goes beyond state law, then please refrain from using the term consistent with. Does state law regarding parking mandates the rules near rail, or does it also mandate rule changes near letter designated buses?
You want me to take that one on, Brendan?
Sure.
You've been talking a lot, and I suspect your voice might be getting a little tired. So, yeah, let me try restating what I think Brendan was trying to cover on the parking slide earlier. House Bill 1110 states that cities that are covered by that law, which Seattle is one, we are not allowed to require on-site parking within a half-mile walk distance of what's called a major transit stop. That is, for us, that is a light rail station or a bus rapid transit station one of the rapid ride lines. You'll note it was in the news just a couple of weeks ago, the opening of the G line, for example, and we have different rapid ride services across the city. There is other bus service in the city that is not covered by that provision of House Bill 1110. And the purple area that's shown on that map is the area that is within that half-mile buffer of those major transit stops. Again, light rail and bus rapid transit. So our code would not require on-site parking within that purple area. Outside of that area, as Brennan talked about, the proposal is to require one space for every 2 units in our neighborhood residential.
And just maybe to be crystal clear, so that means major transit stops include stops both on light rail and on the letter designated buses, which, you know.
Thank you. Yes, yes.
So that, yeah, so both of those areas would be areas in which we, the state law would prevent parking requirements for middle housing, sorry.
And letter designated buses are the rapid ride lines. Just
right.
to be so different ways of referring to it, but yes, the answer is yes.
Great. How was impact to pedestrian greenways evaluated in regards to rezones to neighborhood centers? So this is maybe kind of a question maybe for the environmental impact statement, which is kind of a separate part of it. But I will say that, you know, that was one thing that was considered. You know, obviously, pedestrian greenways are actually kind of great. Pedestrian greenways are an amenity that people want to live nearby, and we want people to be able to live. So there's, you know, a benefit to putting housing near those areas. At the same time, you know, the potential redevelopment can create but doesn't always create you know, more curb ramps driveways. Sometimes it's more or less, but obviously it could create more automobile traffic on those areas. And so I think that was a balance that was considered. There's no kind of one answer to that, but that was something that was considered. The next question is, how will guidance be provided to homeowners wishing to sell or work with developers? So at this stage of the update, you know, the things we're putting out are these kind of high-level proposal documents, which we're looking for feedback on. You know, once we have a piece of legislation, it'll go to council. Council will, you know, review, potentially amend, and vote on those things. Once it becomes available, once it becomes adopted and is effective, then there will be a lot of work to actually make sure that to kind of communicate those changes to the public. And so we as a city have a lot of what we call tips that can explain the rules in kind of everyday language. And so I think that part of the process will be where we'll kind of figure out how to make this clear to homeowners who, you know, are not in the development field every day. So it is an important part of the process, but is something that would be considered a little bit farther down the road.
And I would add to that one of the things we're interested in above and beyond the sort of standard information and technical guidance we would give to homeowners is, and this goes back to the displacement question that was asked earlier, is there are existing homeowners who are at risk of displacement, and one of the ways in which not only those homeowners, but also their extended families or others in communities that are at higher risk of displacement, especially communities that have been impacted by past racist land use practices like redlining. That was a reality here in the city for a number of decades, and we're still seeing some of those effects today. That homeowners we're seeking to identify ways that we can provide technical assistance and provide even access to things like financing or other tools if they want to redevelop their properties. That's more of an idea at this point. We have a couple of initiatives to look at those types of tools and expanding them going forward. But that's another area where assistance to homeowners is particularly crucial. We'd certainly love to hear ideas from community about that.
So next question, HB 1110 states 1/4 mile from major transit stops, not major transit routes. Why is the city distance from the route? So that might have been maybe just a mistranslation of what I was saying. So the two things in which we talk about major transit stops are that we have to allow 6 units within areas that are a quarter mile from a major transit stop, and also there's limitations on parking requirements within a half mile from major transit stops. So both those things in HB 1110 are from the stop, and that is we are intending to use that same approach to the city. So that might have been maybe just a mischaracterization if I said the word route.
And in fact, if you look at, for example, the map that Brendan showed you that showed the purple areas, and I believe that that is one of the slides that's available on our website in an online presentation that you can go back and view at your leisure, you'll see that those areas are radiating out from stops along the line. They're not all the same distance from a transit route. I think you can see that on the map itself.
Michael, this is for you. Please clarify what HB 1110 says. Does it require at least 4 units or merely allow a minimum of 4 or 6 units? IOW, are duplexes allowed in all neighborhood residential zones?
Okay, so there are 2 questions there. So first of all, with regard to, I'll take on the duplexes first. As HB 1110 says that we must allow at least 6 out of a list of 9 different types of housing that are generally in that category of middle housing. So those types include duplexes, triplexes, 4plexes, 5plexes, 6plexes, cottage housing, courtyard apartments, stacked flats, and townhomes. I'm impressed at this list. After all these questions, I remembered all 9. That's the list of 9. Our code would allow all 9, so it includes duplexes. So we have to allow middle housing types. The second question about density is that HB 1110 says that we have to allow at least 4 units, on each lot in residential areas. The proposal we've described does just that. It's at least 4 lots. In fact, even if your lot is a particularly small lot that otherwise wouldn't be allowed per development standards, you would still be allowed to build 4 if you could fit them in. In many cases, that wouldn't be feasible anyway. But just as a matter of code, we have to allow at least 4.
Next question is, will the area near the Elliott Bay cruise ship terminal, which is slated to be high density in the future, be developed as residential? Is the Magnolia Bridge part of that development plan? Is water access part of that plan? So I assume this is the Smith Cove terminal, which is located near the Magnolia Bridge. So that area is currently in manufacturing and industrial center. And the zoning there is industrial. So residential would not be allowed. Obviously, it is possible that there could be some process that might go on to change the zoning for that site, but currently it is not an area in which residential is allowed. I don't know the specifics of the kind of what's being proposed there, so I can't say more than that. So this another question. Your first slide showed 5,000 as the minimum lot size. Are you suggesting that a 5,000 square foot lot can then be subdivided into 4 1,250 square foot lots? So I don't think there was a slide that said 5,000 is a minimum lot size. Rather, for neighborhood residential zones, there is a density limit of 1 unit per 1,250 square feet. And so that means on a 5,000 square foot lot, you could build 4 units. You could subdivide them, or in theory, you could subdivide them into 4 lots and then build on those lots. In practice, it's incredibly difficult to subdivide lots to that small and then build on them. So in practice, what would probably happen is somebody might build 4 units and do what we call a unit lot subdivision, which means that they can be sold separately, but that the 5,000 square foot lot has to meet the development standards rather than each of the 1,250 square foot lots. Essentially, once you break it up that small, the setbacks alone mean that there's very little that you can do there. So, but you can have on a 5,000 square foot lot, you could have 4 units. Related with the density limit, what they're calling the 1 per 1,250 square foot rule, if there's a fraction of a unit, will there be an ability to round up? So for example, if you on a 5,000 square foot lot, that would yield 5.6 units. And so the question is there, could you build 5 units or 6? The answer is no, you cannot round up. If your calculation is 5.6, that means you can build 5 units. There's a question, an ECA does not count to area. Are ECAs counted in FAR calculations? So ECAs are excluded when you measure the density of the site, and so that is the number of units that you could allow, and also the lot coverage of the site. That's the portion of the lot that you could build. They're not exempted from FAR calculations. In practice, that means though that that FAR wouldn't be the limiting factor. Instead, it would be the lot coverage and the height and the density. So practically, you couldn't get a building that maximizes that FAR, even if in theory it's no longer limiting the factor. Okay. Here, if a tenant of affordable housing increases their income so they no longer qualify, what happens? Do they have to move? Can the landlord start charging market rent? Will we demolish the units that no longer qualify for the affordability bonus? So yeah, so that obviously we want people who are in these buildings to have incomes that increase over time. So there is a process that specifically allows for some increase. I'm not an expert in that, so I wouldn't want to give the details, but essentially there is a process by which if you, for example, are a tenant and you qualify for a rental unit that has to be affordable for somebody making 60% of area median income, your income can increase beyond that 60% and you can stay in the home and get the same, that reduced rent. However, there is a point at which if you get too far, your increase is too much that you would no longer be allowed to qualify for that space. In those cases, the person can either the person who's in the building has to start paying market rent, and then a different unit would have to be set aside as affordable to make sure that the total number of units that are affordable are still there. And again, there's a process there which I wouldn't want to get into the details of it.
There's also a term of a period of time within which, when the building is permitted, that the owner needs to retain and maintain that number of affordable units. I believe in both the state under House Bill 1110 and in our affordability bonus that we've added as well. It's, correct me if I'm going to take a stab at it here. So if you can't confirm it, Brennan, we can find this out. It's 50 years, I believe, in both cases, but we can check on that.
Another question is, do we have any bureaucratic mechanisms for housing development other than zoning? The 2 light rail stations around Jackson Park make the golf course a great candidate for transit-oriented social housing development. It would be great to see state-led housing development over there. So I think there's maybe 2 issues there. Obviously the one that the park is owned by Seattle Parks and Rec. So there's a kind of question about whether they would want to give up that space as park space for other uses. But I guess in terms of the other mechanisms, as I mentioned, the city does not acquire property for market rate development. We don't, like some other places, acquire that and put it on the market or use eminent domain. We do not have that authority. And so really the 2 mechanisms that we have are zoning and then also funding of nonprofits. And so obviously we have a whole existing system which where we use money from the levy, from the federal government, from mandatory housing affordability fees, where we have a process by which nonprofit developers can put forward proposals that we can choose to fund or not to create affordable housing. Obviously, there's also now that option for the Social Housing Development Authority to do that same process to get funds either through the city or other mechanisms. But those are really the only ways that the city gets involved in housing development. I mean, there have been some cases in which, for example, there are community centers where we work to kind of partner to put housing above them. So I guess maybe those are really the only ways in which we get involved in housing development. Okay. The zoning is targeted to be implemented in June of 2025. Is it possible to get permitted under the new regulations prior to that date? Okay, so first, just maybe a clarification. Obviously, there's a couple phases here. The changes to neighborhood residential zoning and other things to comply with various state deadlines are proposed to be adopted by council in June of 2025. That would mean they'd become effective a little bit after that, potentially in July. Then there would be the larger rezones to neighborhood centers, frequent transit routes, expanded centers. Those are proposed to be adopted by council in September of 2025. They, however, would have a longer effective period. There's a lot of process that has to go into making all those zoning changes, so it would not be right away. But so those were kind of the effective dates. In terms of getting development permitted under new regulations, once something has been adopted, you are allowed to come in and even if it's been adopted but not effective, you are allowed to come in and start that permitting process. Prior to that, there are mechanisms where you can come in as part of a contract rezone to try and get ahead, but those are very complicated. So I think for the average person, it does not probably make sense to come in until it's adopted.
Brandon, I want to just provide a bit of a clarification on the timeline there. There are some unknowns to the timeline, certainly. What we can tell you is that for the neighborhood residential, we anticipate transmitting the legislation to council in March of 2025 with the intent that the council will be able to adopt that legislation for it to take effect prior to June 30, 2025. We don't know when the council is going to act. That's going to be up to the council and up to that process. So I just want to be really clear about that. It's not something we know at this time. We know when we're intending to transmit it. The same goes for the legislation to adopt the new zoning maps for neighborhood centers and other areas. Our intent is to transmit that legislation to council by May of 2025 with the intent of giving the council time to adopt by roughly September or so. Again, we don't know when that adoption will happen. We don't know exactly what that process is going to look like. But that is it's kind of a subtle difference there, but I just want to make sure that we're not getting ahead of ourselves.
Is the 1.4 FAR for stacked dwelling units only allowed if within a quarter mile of frequent transit? Yes, so that additional higher FAR is only allowed if you are both within a quarter mile of frequent transit. That's the definition, say, of generally 15-minute headways during the week and 30 on the weekends. And you are on a lot that is 6,000 square feet or greater. In other areas, stacked flats are still allowed, but they would be subject to that base standard of 1.2 FAR. One can guess that when this goes through, there will be increased development activity. Does the city plan to start requiring developers to pay fees towards infrastructure and amenities like parks? So that maybe is slightly complicated. Obviously, developers today do have to pay fees towards the utilities, both connection charges and fees. And if the infrastructure in the street is not sufficient, they're also required to do main extensions. So in that sense, that they do pay for kind of utility infrastructure. but I think maybe this is also looking at other things such as impact fees, which are specifically to help pay for improvements to the
streets under state law, streets, parks, schools, I think is the three, if I'm remembering correctly. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And we don't currently have those types of impact fees, and there's no proposal as part of this to start doing that. Maybe there's also, I guess, there's also street improvements. So developers are required to, do improvements like curbs, curb ramps, sidewalks, and also drainage improvements if required to accommodate those other aspects. Those are required in all urban centers and villages today, and in other areas at certain thresholds. We are proposing kind of revisit those potentially now or as part of the future, but we don't have a specific proposal that at this time. And then obviously, I think it's maybe important to note also that, construction pays other fees to the city, both as part of real estate transaction taxes, construction sales taxes. Actually, a pretty substantial portion of our general fund comes from construction sales tax as well. So it is paying for those things indirectly. But if the question is about impact fees, we're not proposing new impact fees at this time. Great, maybe Michael, if you could take this one, just because I'm starting to lose my voice here. What health impacts, air quality, and noise pollution were taken into account for the extremely dense housing next to a freeway? Why aren't they following the 1,000-foot buffer or 500-foot standard to not introduce increased risk for asthma and cardiovascular degree near those areas?
Sure, maybe we can tag team on this a little bit, Brendan, because but I'll spare your voice to start with. So, and the reason is because this starts with the environmental impact statement. So, we one of the things that, as we noted, we've been doing in parallel to developing the actual proposal for the growth strategy for the zoning, is doing an environmental impact statement, which is a set of analyses that take a look at a range of potential impacts, including impacts on noise and air, both to existing residents and potential new residents of new development, including along roadways like freeways. What we do in an EIS is identify those potential impacts and then identify mitigation measures, in other words, things the city can do to reduce those impacts. So we have done that analysis for a range of alternatives in a draft EIS. There will be such an analysis in a final EIS released later this year, accompanying the final plan, that talks about what's the potential degree of that risk, of that impact, and the list of things the city is doing or may be able to do to mitigate it. This is also something that can be mitigated, can be addressed through the actual development permitting process itself. I don't know, Brendan, if you want to take on that part of the answer.
Yeah. Well, I mean, maybe I'll just say, from when we were creating the zoning proposals, distance to freeway was definitely one of the things that was taken into account. However, it's a list of one of many things. Obviously, we're trying to balance a lot of things, putting housing near transit, putting it near shops and services, as well as reducing, minimizing it in environmentally critical areas and near freeways. And so that we're trying to kind of achieve that balance. And so there wasn't kind of one rule that this trumps other things. But obviously we, if we think we're not getting that balance right in some areas, we would definitely, that's one thing we're looking for feedback on.
And I would say, I mean, the one, I don't know if you have the questioner has a particular location in mind in asking the question, but I was thinking of the 130th Northeast 130 Flight Rail Station, for example. And that's a place where we really are trying to balance a number of factors. Now, I mean, obviously to begin with, it's the location of a major new transit access point, a new light rail station. Sound Transit did site that station adjacent to a freeway. There are a number of stations along the Sound Transit line that are on along the freeway, along I-5 primarily, where other cities are also planning for as locations for new growth. If you look at the map of the proposed 130th light rail station, I think this is an example of the outcome of this balancing. You'll see that there is a broad area both to the west and the east of the freeway where most of the new development or housing opportunities aren't right up against the freeway. In part, that's because of the constraints like the Jackson Park and others, but it also is the reality of as that urban center evolves over time, most of the actual housing development won't be directly adjacent to the freeway, but will be within an easy walk or bike or very short transit ride to get to the light rail station. So it reflects the outcome of that balancing that we tried to do.
Next question, will there be any pre-approved multiplex designs similar to the DADU and ADU system? So currently the city has what we call pre-approved designs for smaller projects like accessory dwelling units. And using a pre-approved design means that you can get through the permitting process much more quickly since that basic design has already been reviewed. At this point, we don't have any proposals to create a similar pre-approved projects for multiplexes. That is something that we have on a radar screen and might consider in the future. Overall, it's pretty difficult for a pre-approved multiplex because the site characteristics change so much in different areas that it frequently people have to vary those, which makes them no longer pre-approved. Next question, is the rezoning to neighborhood centers expected to negatively impact home values? So obviously home values are very complicated. There's both the home values of kind of the property assessor uses for property taxes, and there's also what you sell when you sell your house. In terms of like the sales, obviously it is hard to predict. On one hand, that there's kind of additional development potential on those sites, and so on average, that's going to increase the value of a home if developers are interested in potentially buying it to redevelop. But if there's not that interest, it probably will have minimal or no impact. In terms of the property tax assessors, property taxes are assessed based on comparable recent sales in your neighborhood. And so that means in the short term, we're not likely to see any changes in property values kind of either way. But over the longer term, if there is a demonstrated value of other properties are starting to be sold for more of a similar neighborhood, similar zoning, then that could increase the property tax values that the King County assessor uses. On the other hand, we have a 1% property tax cap with some complicated exceptions. And what that means is that, over the city as a whole, there's a lot of zoning changes that are happening here. And so if, property values are worth more across the city, then that property tax cap will mean that, if it's happening across the board, that the property taxes would not go up with that larger increase. So this may be a more complicated answer than was needed. Seattle is very hilly. When you speak of a maximum height on a lot that is sloped, is the maximum height measured from the street level, from the highest point in the lot or the lowest point on the lot? So the Seattle Municipal Code has kind of detailed provisions about this, how this works. In general, though, it is the average height. So if you have a sloped lot and it's, you say, 10 feet higher on one side and than the other, that it uses kind of that middle. However, there are some, for larger buildings, there are some things that allow for some averaging so that, as it slopes, you can have it a little bit lower on one side, a little higher on the other side. Many lots along Woodland Park Avenue are 4,800 square feet. Would these 4,800 square foot lots be considered as 5,000 in the rezoning proposal? So if you look at the density limit, that size lot would only give you a calculation of 3 But under state law, we are required to allow 4 units on those lots, or 6 if they're near major transit, or if 2 of the units are affordable. And that's a good example of kind of a smaller lot where the kind of state's minimum requirement would override our density limit.
And to be clear there, that doesn't mean the actual development would be at 4 units per each of those lots. I mean, this is an example of 4,800 square foot lots. There are lots smaller that are smaller than that in different neighborhoods in the city. Let's say a 4,000 square foot lot. The code would allow 4 units, be it 4,000 or 4,800 square feet, but other aspects of our development standards, which such as setbacks and heights and FAR, would also shape that development such that in many cases new development would likely be less than the 4 units on many of those smaller lots. It might be 2 or 3. It really depends. So, but it would be the maximum that we must allow the 4. But we understand that in reality, as this plays out over time, there's going to be a lot of variety in what actually happens.
Is terrain steepness considered in walking to transit time? And is the distance for walking as the crow flies or along a path? So in developing the boundaries for the different neighborhood centers, we did use a walking distance, as well for the expansions. That is generally a 4-minute distance from the central intersection for neighborhood centers, and an 8-minute for regional and urban, or for urban centers that don't have light rail, or a 10-minute walk shed for centers that do have light rail. However, that just kind of created an initial boundary proposal, and then we did a lot of work to look at local circumstances to figure out what, and those were tailored in many cases. In that analysis that we did, it is a walking path. Measures the walking time along basically along sidewalks. So you have to stick to the streets. Even if sidewalks exist, it's through the streets. So it's not as the crow flies, but it's along places where people are actually allowed to walk. And our model does include terrain steepness, so steeper areas that walk shed is smaller. So it is accounted there.
And both Microsoft and I'm going to remind everybody, we just got the 5-minute warning that we have 5 minutes left in this online info session. So we'll take maybe another question or 2 if we have any. And then I would invite, we have many opportunities for you to show up in person. There's another virtual session later in the fall, and as well as the office hours the staff will have. Please visit our website for a schedule and opportunities to sign up for those. I just want to let people know, maybe 1 or 2 more questions, and then we'll call it an evening.
The good news is there's only one question, as far as I can tell, that we haven't answered. So this is
4-minute question, I hope.
And maybe, Michael, you can take this one. What is the state's definition of a bus stop near which parking requirements are disallowed? Seattle's letter designated buses seem not significantly different from the number designated buses.
Yeah. So with regard to buses, this gets to the definition, state law. So the text of the requirement in House Bill 1110 says we can't require off-street parking within a half-mile walk distance of a major transit stop. And if you go to the definitions section of that bill, or just generally it's now in the definitions and the Growth Management Act as a statute, it defines major transit stop. Among the types of transit that meet that definition is bus rapid transit, and that is an enhanced bus service that with more developed stops and amenities for riders and reliability improvements to provide high capacity transit along defined routes. So those are our lettered routes, G, A, B, C, D, E. The other rapid ride lines have these improvements. They are bus rapid transit under state law, so they are covered under that provision of House Bill 1110.
Great. Well, thank you very much for coming and asking questions. Just you can see on your screen a reminder that we're going to have another of these virtual info sessions in December, but we're also going to have 7 in-person sessions over the next coming months. The next one is the first of those is at the National Nordic Museum in Ballard on Wednesday, October 30th. So please do tell other people if you've not seen this. That about that event. I also going to share my screen here again. Yeah.
No, Brendan, before you move on, just want to make clear to folks that the in-person events are going to be one in each of the council districts. There will be a geographic focus to the information presented at each of those in-person sessions. So generally there'll be a focus if it's in district district 5, right? Or is that 6? I'm
6.
blanking. 6, thank you. I knew we've been here for a while. Just in District 6, we will focus on Ballard and surrounding neighborhoods. So if you have an interest in different parts of the city, do know that when you're planning to attend the in-person sessions.
And I think also important that the format for that will not quite the same as this. We are not going to have a formal presentation. Instead, it's going to be an open house. You can come anytime. There will be boards that give a lot of this detail, and there'll be opportunity to talk with staff in a kind of informal setting about anything you might have.
Yeah.
And so obviously, yeah, so for more resources, please go to our website, zoning.oneseattleplan.com. That's also the place to go to comment. There's a general commenting forum. You can also place comments, location-specific comments on the map. And if there's any questions that you have that come up later that we didn't answer, please email us at oneseattleplan.zoning@seattle.gov.
Great. Thank you, everybody. Have a good evening, and we look forward to hearing your comments.